Welcome to Part 2 of the two-part webinar, Transitions to Adulthood 101 by Maryann Davis, Director of the Transitions RTC. In this section, Dr. Davis reviews the biopsychosocial development of typical young adults compared to that of young adults with serious mental health conditions. She describes the implications that this development has on interventions, research studies, and knowledge translation activities being developed for this unique population, while also touching on some specific areas of research that are being conducted at the Transitions RTC.
What I want to use the rest of our time doing is reviewing a little bit about the developmental stage of the transition to adulthood. One of the things that I wanted to consider in thinking about what to put in this presentation this afternoon or this morning if you're out on the West Coast is that for the folks who are listening, we range from people who are really very experienced with the transition age population already and are personally in their working lives and in their personal lives very much aware of what this stage of development is like, to folks who are much more familiar with adult services or the adult service system and maybe less familiar with these developmental stages. So as a way to get us all on the same page, I wanted to briefly review sort of what is typical biopsychosocial development as adolescents move into adulthood, review a little bit about what we know about the biopsychosocial development for the population that has serious mental health conditions, and think a little bit about the implications of that for the interventions that we're developing or for the studies that we're conducting, or for the knowledge translation activities that we're conducting as well. So that's what this next portion will be focusing on. And in essence, what we know about that transition to adulthood is that it really involves developmental change on every front. The sort of standard areas of psychosocial development have to do with cognitive development, moral and social development, sexual development, both in terms of physical development as well as sexual behavior, and identity formation. What we know about typical cognitive development, and I apologize, this turned out very light in the translation to this template, but let me tell you briefly that the maturation of cognitive skills and cognitive abilities really goes from the ability to think concretely to thinking abstractly. And concretely is thinking about things that you can touch or feel or observe right in front of you. Thinking abstractly means you basically have to hold it in your mind. So thinking hypothetically, if I become pregnant, I probably won't finish high school, but my boyfriend might marry me. But if he doesn't, then what happens? That's all hypothetical thinking, is the if-thens, the what-ifs. That is something that starts to become more of a capacity during adolescence. The ability to plan for the future, which is clearly very critical to preparing for adulthood and moving into adulthood, is all abstract thinking. Before I get an apartment, I need to get a job, I need to save money, work on a budget. To be able to sequence those things and plan our abstract abilities. Having insight, that classic aspect of psychotherapy. Every time an older man questions what I do, I get terribly angry. He reminds me of my father. That ability to have insight into some of these very abstract things is another hallmark of adolescence. As individuals move into young adulthood, they have an increasing ability for insight. And basically, these changes allow individuals to examine their own choice process and have a better understanding of themselves and of others. That basic ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes is also an abstraction. So as we develop our cognitive abilities, they have an impact on our social abilities and our social development. One of the things that we know about typical social development during adolescence and in moving into young adulthood is the huge, paramount, ultimate importance of peer relationships, which peaks during adolescence, probably not coincidentally around the time that individuals are in a very large social setting, that of high school. And remains important and probably sets the foundation for friendship capacities in young adulthood. There are changes in the nature of friendship that occur as individuals move into adolescence, that these friendships become much more complex. They involve mutuality, where you do for one another. They involve sharing intimacy, things that you don't share with others, and demonstrations of loyalty. Friendships become very complicated during this stage of life, and they really continue thereout. And the capacities that are required for maintaining those friendships rely on the development of cognitive skills and capacities. Typical moral development goes from toddlers essentially believe or think that what is good is what they get rewarded for, and what is bad is what they get punished for. And the development of a moral structure basically is the internalization of those rights and wrongs that coincides with cognitive capacities. So when children are sort of in elementary school, their capacity to understand that is fairly rigid. Things are either right or wrong. There's very few gray areas. To, as we move into adolescence and we can think more abstractly, that we can develop our empathic responses and follow the golden rule to do unto others. And then the ultimate, at least in Western society, moral stance is sacrificing for the greater good, which requires a tremendous ability to think abstractly. Typical sexual development at this stage of life, as we know, there's the physical maturation and then the behavior that goes along with that, which brings to relevance life-impacting and safety issues that weren't relevant when children are younger for the most part. This is typically where sexual orientation becomes much more clear to individuals or becomes acted upon. It affords a new type of intimacy for individuals. It can also have an impact on their role in their peer groups. So there's a lot of implication of the development of our sexual lives, which becomes active primarily, ideally, during adolescence and into young adulthood. And then typical identity formation really has to do with that task of answering the question, who am I? That in many ways is the hallmark of adolescence and increasingly continuing to move into adulthood. The first level of that is who am I that I'm not my parents? So it's that big push away, typically around ages 12, 13, 14, where an individual often, if a parent says something is good, that person's knee-jerk reaction to that is that it's horrible. It is typically just the opposite. It's a way of saying, I'm not sure who I am, but I'm not you. To answering the more nuanced question of who am I that I'm not my parents, who am I that as a student, a worker, romantic partner, who am I in the world, and what do I do and who do I want doing that with me? It's a huge task to figure out who we are at this stage of life. And mature identity formation allows us to feel connected to others while being aware of our own uniqueness, which allows us to rely on our own judgments rather than being so much at the sway of others' judgments of us. The bottom line for the population of young people with serious mental health conditions is for a wide variety of reasons. Most studies that have looked at these questions have found that their development is delayed in each of these areas except in the physical development of sexual development and, of course, in any other area of physical development. So most studies have shown that there's a delay in each of these areas. Being in this stage of development and having developmental delay in these areas have overwhelming implications for the various interventions that we develop. In general, we want to keep in mind that individuals mature at different rates, that a given individual may be more mature in one area or than in another. The interventions should be tailored to the maturity level of each individual. It's one of the things that we need to be able to assess for is how far along in developing these capacities are each individual that we're working with, and that overwhelmingly interventions that are for younger individuals, younger chronologically or younger maturationally, those interventions should look different from interventions that are older for older individuals, even within the transition age youth and young adult group. So when we talk about, I often see people talking about an intervention for transition age youth, for example, and it is sort of a singular approach that tends to do what we do with adult interventions, which is not to recognize the diversity that we'll see in development within this age group. So we need to be sure that our interventions are developmentally appropriate for each age along this continuum into mature adulthood. So thinking a little bit about the implications, these are just some things that I've thought of over the years are some of the implications for our interventions. The data that form these really are data that basically says that there's developmental delay, and but here's what is typical for development. And when you think about that, then apply that to your intervention. I'm sure each of you can come up with probably another handful of implications that I haven't listed here, but it's a good way to kind of get our thinking caps on about what we might want to do either in our interventions, in our studies, or in our knowledge translation activities. So the first thing is to recognize that planning and goal setting requires abstraction. To help with abstraction, if somebody's having struggles in those areas, coming up with examples are very helpful to concretize. Having live practice of things like a job interview makes things much more concrete. To have dry runs of that, to maybe plan on a couple job interviews that aren't likely to pan out just to get somebody experience, those are all ways to make things much more concrete when it's hard to plan. Repetition also is very helpful in ensuring that things that may be a little bit more abstract become more concrete over time. And the other aspect is that for most of the skills that we're trying to teach, we typically find that the opportunity to teach them will present itself repeatedly. So practice, practice, practice is an important thing, but also to feel that there will be plenty of opportunities to repeat or to go back to maybe a lesson that's already been approached before. The nice thing about this stage of life is that we're allowed to practice and we're allowed to make mistakes and we're allowed to try all over again, whereas developmentally that's much less acceptable when we're more mature adults. So it is something that is acceptable now for very good reason. Implications for interventions along the continuum or the areas of social and moral development. It's really important when we're working with young people in this stage of life is to realize just how strong that desire is for social relations that are good and peer acceptance. What we know from studies is that for a wide variety of reasons having to do with social skills, moral development, and probably opportunity, is that the number of friends and acquaintances tends to be lower for this population than for same-age peers. And that the duration of friendships and the quality or the strength of the attachment tends to be less. So their friendships tend to be shorter and maybe not as well established and as strong as they are for same-age peers. And that this is something that very much can be a focus in our interventions because social networks are part of the strength of how young adults move into adult life successfully. As a consequence of the strength of the desire for peer acceptance or for the strength of peer relations, we know that peers can be very powerful factors in our interventions. It's important to know that they can be powerful both positively and negatively, so trying to ensure that the impact is powerful. I always think it's an interesting example to think about some of the work that clubhouses have done in developing a program that's more appealing to young adults. When I was first talking with some of the clubhouses that were doing some of this work, they felt very strongly that they wanted their program for young adults to be integrated into their program with older adults. And my first reaction to that, because of many clinical programs that found that integrating young adults with older adults had some really negative impacts for the young adults, was that that may not be a good idea. And probably not too shockingly, they didn't follow my advice on that and developed an intervention that included both young adults with older adults, and it has worked out really wonderfully. But they were very mindful of developing sort of a critical mass of young adults that could welcome other young adults and make it feel like a place where socializing as a young adult was appealing. So it's just important to look at the role of peers. It's an important opportunity to teach social problem solving at this stage of life, again in a way that you can't do when individuals are older. It's, I think, much more acceptable at this stage of life. Sexual development, I'm actually going to skip through here because time is fleeting, but basically some of the pieces to keep in mind are interventions don't really typically focus very directly on their developing sexual maturity, but sexual maturity is something that can have a tremendous impact on our abilities to help individuals complete their schooling and move into their working life successfully. And so maybe the most important thing is to keep in mind that if it's not something that our interventions are going to be dealing with directly, is to promote conversations or connect them with an atmosphere in which these many sexual issues can be discussed or resolved, because they will have an impact often on their abilities to finish school successfully and move into their working lives. And that when we do our intervention planning, that issues of parenting, of pregnancy, the impact of sexually transmitted diseases, of sexual victimization, and even of sexual perpetration are not uncommon, that we just don't want to bury our heads in the sand around these issues, because they are very powerful issues at this stage of life, and they definitely have an impact on schooling and learning and working. Identity formation, I think, in many ways is one of the areas in which we often get the most tripped up. For many individuals who are primarily used to working with mature adults or with younger adolescents or children, the intensity of some of the activities that come with identity formation, resolution, can be really difficult to deal with. Primarily, we often want to just make young people either act more responsibly or to just stop trying things that we think of as either unsafe or just not beneficial. We often feel a pull to act authoritative or parentally, and one of the keys for interventions is to not move into that position. Talking, say, for example, with case managers who often work, who mostly work with adults in the mental health system, they may find more success in simply saying, here's what I think is good for you. Not that this is a very good approach, but a more authoritative or an expectation that if I suggest to you that this is what you should do, that you will do it. Where for young adults and transition age youth, coming to that conclusion definitely needs to be a process that is reached mutually, and that you can expect that any type of authoritative approach will probably get some fair resistance. We have to build programs that expect for boundary pushing, for experimentation. The most concrete examples in living situations, I often hear for some adult housing programs that they have some very concrete rules around it, things that like having overnight guests, or around having any substances on the premises. And when we think about young adults' living situations, college dorms, or when they're moving out on their own, we can see that we might be setting ourselves up for failure when we can't take into consideration that it's an age-typical thing to experiment with lots of different aspects of life as we figure out what we want to do with our lives. And so we need to build that into our interventions. One of the most beneficial things that we can do is to review the choices that young people make and think about the consequences that there might be for those choices, and review their alternatives with them to help them develop their own sense of what they want to be doing and what are the consequences for their various choices. And lastly, just to think about the complexity of family relationships, that we have family relationships that are very complex during this stage of life. This is one of the major things that young people are doing, is figuring out how they develop their autonomy, from their dependence on families, that it's an interdependence for a period of time for some individuals, and for some cultures we retain an interdependence, but during the initial stages of young adulthood, that dance between parents being supportive, being guiding, being leading, and letting a young person start to take charge of their own lives and making some of those risks and relying on others more can be very delicate. I think often people who work with adolescents are more acutely aware of sort of the complexities of involving parents and how to do that in partnership, and then how to bring young people in. That needs to be extended into young adulthood, where we certainly don't write off family members as being irrelevant in their lives. They still are often the most critical and long-standing individuals in a young person's life and are a critical resource to them. Yet at the same time, we're trying to help an individual develop their autonomy. So it's a very difficult dance. And a complex one that we have very little data around how to do, but it's clearly one of the pieces that I think we are all working with as we're looking at how to develop these interventions. Now, Catherine's flashing me, we need to wrap up. And one of the things I have to say as I go through very quickly these very last slides is one can have an 8-hour workshop on working with transition age youth and young adults and still not get to all of the critical issues. I think in terms of us thinking about our interventions and our studies and our knowledge translation activities, the consideration of where they are developmentally and the implications for interventions probably forms the heart of why our work is different from the work that people do with children and adolescents and the work that people do with adults. There are some complex system considerations that are important when we think about the research that we do and the interventions that we develop in terms of what systems those services may be placed into, or the impact of the offering of services through different systems and the different characteristics of those systems that may have an impact on the success of these interventions. Which is why at least one of our studies focuses on some system-level impacts on interventions. And that the nature of the child system is quite different from the adult system, and transition age youth and young adults walk from one system to the next, and often some of the most difficult things for them is the contrast between the ways each of those systems function. And the last of this, people can go through these slides, will be available to folks. It was an example of how we took one intervention that had a very strong evidence base and decided about how we were going to connect the dots between what we know about what works for adolescents and what works for adults, and try to develop something for emerging adults. This is our Multisystemic Therapy for Emerging Adults project. On this RTC, we're taking a particular examination of one of the adaptations of that, which was to add a life coach, which is a type of mentor position to the team approach, to see if we couldn't use that as a way to provide stronger vocational supports for a very vulnerable group of young adults who both have a serious mental health condition and recent involvement with the justice system. So that is what these last slides are about. But I think at this point, the best thing may be to take questions.
For the purposes of packaging this webinar, we have not included the question and answer section. However, we do welcome you to send us any questions on this content. Please email all questions to transitionsrtc@umassmed.edu.